Good morning, everyone. Well, good morning and happy Pride Month. My name is Kyle Roberts, and I'm the Associate Director of Library and Museum Programming here at the American Philosophical Society. And I want to welcome you all to the Friday panels of our Spring Symposium, Open Data, Reuse, Redistribution, and Risk. This is, of course, inspired by the Open Data Initiative here at the APS, which you'll be hearing a little bit more about this morning. To begin, I want to acknowledge that the American Philosophical Society resides in what is now known as Philadelphia, which is in Lenapehoking, the homeland of the Lenape people, whose relationships and connections to the land continue to this day and into the future. In recognizing this, the Society expresses its thanks for the past and ongoing generosity of the Lenape, as well as that of numerous other indigenous communities across this continent, who have offered to us their guidance, their expertise, and many, many opportunities for collaboration. It really is their generosity which makes the work of the Society's Library and Museum possible. Let's see. For those of you who are new to us, the American Philosophical Society was founded in 1743 by Benjamin Franklin. And the Society really strives to be a catalyst for the discovery of new knowledge. Election to membership honors those who have made exceptionally significant contributions to the sciences, the arts and humanities, and public life. The Society holds meetings twice a year in April and November, which highlights leading research in the humanities and sciences. I encourage you, they're all streamed live to the public. I encourage you to watch them. They're really fantastic presentations. The Society has the longest continuously running scholarly imprint in what's now the United States. Founded in 1771. If any of you are looking for publishing opportunities, please talk to us. We have a long history of offering research grants, both for field-based research as well as for resident research fellowship. We award over $1.5 million a year in a diverse range of fields. And we really try to strive to support younger scholars who really, especially in these times, need the support the most. We have a museum, which is on our campus in Philosophical Hall. In the before times, we would have 140,000 people visit us a year. In the after times, where we continue to enforce social distancing, that number is lower. But I hope all of you today, if you have a chance and want to stretch your legs, will see our newest exhibition, Becoming Weatherwise, the history of climate science in America. Philosophical Hall is kind of kitty corner across the street. Ask Nathan at the front if you want any directions on how to get over there. Selfishly, I would love it if any of you would go over and share what you think, because there's a lot of fantastic data visualizations from the last couple of centuries, and I feel like this is a good crowd for appreciating that. Our library and museum collections and research centers serve scholars and visitors from across the globe. The library, if you're not familiar with it, has concentrations in 3 areas: early America, Native American and indigenous linguistic and cultural materials, and the history of science. And we have, at last-ish count, 14 million pages of manuscripts, 275,000 books, 250,000 images, digitized audio, video, lots of really fantastic things. We offer 60-plus fellowships a year, so if anybody sitting out there or online hasn't applied for a fellowship yet, please do so. We would love to have you come and be in residence with us, whether it's for a month or a year. So today's symposium on open data is really inspired by the work of the Center for Digital Scholarship, and particularly the Open Data Initiative. And under this initiative, the center works to identify content in the APS library and museum that is conducive to be reconfigured as data sets. And it encourages the use and reuse of that data by opening the data to all and by easing access to the data as much as possible. These data sets are freely downloadable, and they're available for anyone to evaluate, share, reuse, remix in any way that they wish. And you can find easily on our website a link to our open access policy. These really, we think, are ideal resources, whether you're using them for your own research, whether you want to use them in the classroom. And anybody who's worked with our materials in the classroom, we would love to hear more about that so that we can share that news. Or to develop your own individual digital humanities projects, whether you're interested in mapping, text analysis, or any number of other approaches. This initiative began in 2015, which is really quite wonderful to be able to sit up here and show the fruits of 7 years of that work. And I just want to acknowledge those who have really been essential to making this initiative happen. They include current and former staff members, Sophie Ziegler, who you will see presenting very soon, Bayard Miller, David Nelson, Sabrina Bocanegra, Cynthia Hyder, Bethany Farrell, as well as many other fellows and interns. And these open data projects, and you heard a little bit about them from my colleague Bob Hauser last night, bring forward often difficult to use analog sources that are incredibly data rich, including the indenture book kept by the city of Philadelphia from 1771 to 1773, 5,000 records that include an immense amount of biographical information about individuals whose labor was sold, often for them, not by them, and the people who bought their labor. Our current focus is on meteorological records, and I'm very proud that the CDS is involved with the Jefferson Papers at Princeton and the Center for Digital Editing at UVA to work on a new platform for displaying historic meteorological records. We have a conference in the fall on living with climate change, so you can imagine the sheer importance of these past records. You can find up there now the records that James Madison kept at his Montpelier plantation. Volumes that show not just the weather, but also notes on plant sowing, harvesting, bird migration, and other seasonal phenomena. Records which I think we would also want to think about raise the issue of sort of visible and invisible labor, who was doing the work of doing this recording. Other records that I would just point out, which you can get through GitHub, include our Eastern State Penitentiary records, so all the admissions. Those of you interested in the histories of incarceration, I encourage you to look at those. Franklin's postal records, and very soon the ledger books from Deborah Reed and Benjamin Franklin's shop. And these are particularly interesting for those of you interested in economic history and women's history, because the work of this has actually allowed us to rather conclusively document the vast percentage of entries that were actually made by Deborah Reed Franklin. So recentering a narrative about who was really instrumental to the building of Franklin's wealth. So if you are interested in working with any of these data sets or just want to hang out here for 1 to 2 months, I want to remind you that we have Digital Humanities Fellowships. The deadline has just passed for 2022-2023, but the next round will be up and posted in the late fall. These are opportunities for folks to come in and utilize our collections, our open data sets, or other APS holdings to advance any component of their independent research project or their teaching. One of our 2 fellows is a high school teacher from New Jersey who's coming in to develop curriculum based on our Revolutionary City project. So we are very broad in our understanding and the projects we want to support. These are also opportunities for those who want to apply existing tools and expertise to digital projects developed in collaboration with our Center for Digital Scholarship. And I see Serenity Sutherland here, who is working with CDS right now on a great DH project around visualizing women in science for another upcoming exhibition. So, very proud of what we're doing here. So to today, we hope everyone here in Franklin Hall and out there online will feel comfortable participating in the conference. If you have any questions, please reach out to my fantastic colleagues who are really instrumental in making this happen. Adriana Link, who is sitting there at the back table, Nathan Kinsey, who is at the front. There would not be a conference without their hard labor on this. The schedule, of course, is in the program booklet. You can also find it online. We have 4 panels today. We'll keep the panels to about an hour and then have a 15-minute break between each. Lunch is on your own. There are so many great restaurants in the area. We hope you'll take advantage of them. There is a list at the front desk if you need some suggestions. There are also pre-circulated papers for today, so everybody who's registered should have gotten a link to those papers. If you don't have that link, Nathan can provide that to you. The papers will remain up after the conference, so if you had a chance to read them, great. If you haven't had a chance to read them, then they will be there for you to look at afterwards. There's going to be hopefully lots of ways for you to participate, and I really do want to make sure that this is a conversation today. So if you're in person, Nathan and I will be walking around with the microphone. If you're online, either watching on Boxcast or on Facebook, feel free to ask a question at any time. Adriana is moderating those questions, and we'll make sure that they get into the conversation. All of this is being recorded as well. So if there was a great panel and you want to recommend it to a friend, check back on our YouTube page in a couple weeks, and the link should be there. If you're on social media, you can use the conference hashtag APS Online Data 2022. If you're on Twitter, Instagram, or Facebook, feel free to go ahead and follow us. Bathrooms. We have bathrooms. You might like bathrooms. You can find them on the first floor next to the elevator, and women's room, and then men's room on the basement and on the second floor. All right, so I think it's enough of logistics. I am actually a little ahead of schedule, which is great. So I'd like to invite the participants in our first panel, data, stakeholders, and communities, to come up to the stage. And while you are coming up, it will be my pleasure to introduce the moderator for our first panel, Alex Poole. So Alex Poole is an associate professor at Drexel University's College of Computing and Informatics, who studies archives and records management, diversity, equity, inclusion, information practices, digital curation, and digital humanities. A graduate of the best undergraduate college in the country, Williams, Brown University, and UNC Chapel Hill. I went to Williams, that should be obvious.
I thought that much.
Yeah. Dr. Poole has published his work widely in journals including the Journal of the Association of Information Science and Technology, Library and Information Science Research, the Journal of Documentation, the Library Quarterly, DHQ, the American Archivist, Archival Science, the International Journal of Information Management, and Information and Culture, among other venues. And very rightly, his work has won numerous awards, including the Donald G. David Award, the Justin Windsor Prize, and the Jesse Scherer Award from the American Library Association, plus a whole slew of others, which I won't embarrass him by going into. So with that, let me turn it over to Alex, and I look forward to this first panel.
Well, good morning, colleagues, and thank you all for being here. As you might imagine, it's a pleasure and an honor for me to be here. With that in mind, I'd like to thank, of course, Kyle for his kindness in inviting me, as well as his team, Adriana and Nathan. All three of them have been most generous with their time in helping me get oriented to this event. I would be remiss, moreover, if I didn't thank the panelists. I greatly enjoyed reading the papers, and I look forward to their reading of the papers as well as to a robust Q&A subsequent to that. Now, to get us started, I'd like to introduce our esteemed panelists. First, Unmil Karadkar blends techniques from social, information, and computer sciences to study the creation, management, and use of digital data for supporting scholarship in various disciplines. The increasing variety and significance of research data has enabled him to collaborate and publish with scholars in areas as diverse as geosciences, educational technology, mental health, history, nursing, astrodynamics, and power systems engineering. Moreover, his research has been funded by the National Science Foundation, the Mellon Foundation, and Texas General Land Office. Reflecting a diversity of research questions and methods, he has worked in academic departments in computer science, information science, and the humanities. He currently holds a dual appointment as senior scientist in CIRAC at the University of Graz and as a research associate in the School of Information at the University of Texas at Austin. Second, Linford D. Fisher is an associate professor of history at Brown University. He is the author of The Indian Great Awakening, Religion and the Shaping of Native Cultures in Early America. He is also the co-author of Decoding Roger Williams, the Lost Essay of Rhode Island's founding father. Fisher is the principal investigator of a digital project titled Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas, which is a community-centered collaborative project that seeks to broaden our understanding of indigenous experiences of settler colonialism and its legacies through the lens of slavery and servitude. Fisher is the author of more than a dozen articles, book chapters, and essays on a diverse array of topics. He is currently finishing a book-length project, tentatively entitled America Enslaved, Native Slavery in the English Caribbean and the United States, on Native American enslavement in English colonies in North America and the Caribbean, and later in the United States between Columbus and the American Civil War. Our third panelist is Lydia Curliss, who is a member of the Nipmuc tribe and a PhD student at the University of Maryland iSchool. Her research focuses on looking at archival institutions through an indigenous lens, particularly focused on how institutions can better support the information needs of communities. Previously, she received her MLS and MIS from Indiana University and her BA in geology from Oberlin College. She also serves as a core team member for the Stolen Relations Project at Brown University. And in her free time, she enjoys beading, painting, and playing with her 2 cats. Finally, Sophie Ziegler is head of digital programs and services at LSU Libraries, where they manage the Louisiana Digital Library, which is a statewide effort to collect, preserve, and promote the digital cultural heritage of Louisiana. Prior to 2018, they were the head of digital scholarship at the American Philosophical Society. They are the founding editor of the Journal of Critical Digital Librarianship and the founding oral historian of the Louisiana Trans Oral History Project. When they're not working to diversify Louisiana's cultural heritage, they're usually playing video games with their kids or walking around the neighborhood with their dog, Pancake. Welcome again, and thank you very much.
Thank you so much for a great introduction and for a great keynote yesterday. It's really fascinating to be here, and I'm looking forward to hearing what everyone else has to say. So it's kind of intimidating to go first and say stuff, but I'll try. I'm going to talk about the issues involved in medical data sets. While it's great to be able to create data sets and have them be open and have people remix and replay with them and redo things and recreate things in different shapes, it's incredibly hard to do that with medical information. Right? So you'll see there's a lot of words in there that I have glossed over, because what I want to focus about is medical databases and how you can facilitate openness in different ways. The story begins in the Central State Hospital in Petersburg, Virginia, just after the Civil War, when this institution was created to be the first hospital in the country as a psychiatric care facility for the newly freed African-American citizens, I guess. It was race segregated due to Jim Crow's laws till 1968. And when it was integrated, and the institution continues to operate to this day, they have a couple hundred patients, and like every other place, they are facing budget crunches, and they have to make choices all the time. This was the first institution opened in the country, and probably in the world, for mental health care for African Americans at the time. And then, through the newly freed South, a lot of hospitals opened up at the state level, following the model of the Central State Hospital. So it was a leader back in the time, and we are hoping that through our efforts, the digital work that we are doing will help us and the hospital lead again in the era of digital medical historical records. The records are impeccably well kept. Okay? There are records of all kinds. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but this is just a snapshot of what's out there. But they're not housed in any kind of archival facility. They're exposed to normal room conditions, and after about 100 years, the effects are starting to add up. And that's how they came to the notion of creating a digital collection for the long-term preservation of these records. These are the particularly interesting records that most people want to get access to, right? Admission, readmission, commitment, diagnosis, treatment, ward books. And of course, these are the most problematic records to give people access to. There's a lot of research potential here, and the records have been used in research for understanding historical patterns of structural racial discriminations. They're of interest to families who want to understand the stories of their loved ones. They are of press interest, and they are of interest to technologists who could use new methods to decipher handwriting from old documents. The collection has been digitized. We have about 750,000 scans, over 12 terabytes of disk space in extremely high resolution color copies. We have extracted a lot of data of about 45,000 patients, including we have mapped some arrivals, departures. We have imaging and some spreadsheets. We have created workflows for facilitating transfer, metadata profiles, machine learning, and crowdsourcing to fix what is admittedly imperfect machine learning, right? I wish you would have attended all of those presentations. This is a different talk, right? The collection is closed by design. We give access to people in extremely rare circumstances. So if you would like to access these records, here are the kinds of hoops that you would have to jump through. So, well, and by the way, knowing me does not count as a connection. Connection is being related to one of the people who were admitted there at one time. Back when we were getting started, we had invited input from a variety of stakeholders, right? This wasn't something we came to and then did not know what to do with. This was something we went in with our eyes wide open. We had scholars from a variety of disciplines. We had archivists from the State Library of Virginia, medical director of the Central State Hospital. The Dinwiddie County Historical Society sent a member as representative of the families. The Virginia Attorney General's office did not participate. They sent someone in their personal capacity to be present at the meeting, but not voice an opinion. What we found from this two-day roundtable was that the expectations of researchers from this data set were drastically different, right? Historians wanted long case studies and lawyers wanted snippy data sets, two-dimensional spreadsheets and things. Families wanted information about their loved ones, but they did not want anyone else to find out what happened to their loved ones. The Central State Hospital was wondering if it could use this historical information for enhancing their medical care today. The Library of Virginia, which is tasked with all kinds of preservation information, wanted to have assurances about its preservation. And the Attorney General's office was mostly thinking, how can we get people to not sue us? Because there are damning incidents documented in these records. Because these are records of the deceased, they fall under a variety of legal obligations. HIPAA is the one that gets most talked about. Records of deceased people have to be protected up to 50 years. But the one that really applies is the Virginia Public Records Act, which puts the Library of Virginia in charge, which has caused some brush with the Central State Hospital because they actually hold the records. And the Virginia Public Records Act sets the limit at 75 years. But the library, to minimize their exposure, has decided to extend it to 125 years. And then came a wrinkle that we had not really foreseen. Because the collection would be housed in Texas By the way, no one wants access to the digital collection because no one has the capacity for this. So they said, we'll help you digitize it, but you take care of this hot potato. So the collection actually sits in Texas under agreements with the library and the Central State Hospital. And so one of the governing statute ends up being House Bill 300, which, by the way, makes health data applicable to universities, researchers, and IT services suddenly become covered entities, which are not under HIPAA and not under Virginia statutes. So anyone who wants to work with this data suddenly becomes liable under Texas House Bill 300, and there is no sunset clause, so the records have to be confidential in perpetuity. What does that mean for us? So the policies are still evolving. There's a lot of ongoing dialogue with the family members, with CSH, with the Library of Virginia. There is ongoing dialogue about descendants' rights. What role should the families have in the say of what happens to these records? And in the traditional archives work, there is not a lot of literature on this. In the traditional medical records work, there's not a lot of literature on this. So we have fallen back on reviewing materials from the community archives, the indigenous archives, and there is a robust body of literature to draw on in that domain. The researchers who access these records need IRB approval from their home institution, verified by the University of Texas, plus HP 300 certification. Families can get information to the extent that we can find it, but it's incredibly hard to verify who is a family member. Documentation is really sparse and questionable. CSH has a copy of these records, and press only has access to the published articles. I don't want you to go away thinking that this is only a problem for historical materials. This is a forward-going problem. I'm currently serving as the leader for data governance on a project called Aging in Data. It's a 10-country partnership funded through Canada. There are 40 plus PIs collecting data about aging populations. So now we are dealing with country-specific regulations. We are dealing with disadvantaged populations, vulnerable populations, people with dementia potentially. And questions of autonomy, questions of family relationships are absolutely relevant to new data sets being created about new people where medical data may not even be a concern, right? These could be other kinds of things. This could be location data, this could be device use data. But if it is about a vulnerable population, how do we manage? Who do we give access to? These are all incredibly important questions going ahead for all kinds of data sets that we are going to collect under this project. I am one member of this team shown on the left here. King Davis is the leader. He lives in Virginia. The rest of us did this work with him when we were all at UT Austin. The project has been funded by a lot of entities, and a lot of people have given their time and their effort to our project for its success. So thanks to all of them, and thank you.
I don't see it actually, sorry. Is it this one here? No. Which one? This one here? Yes. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Those in the room, online, the balcony, which I didn't know existed until I came up here. Really nice to see you. It's excellent to be here in person. My name is Linford Fisher. My colleague and I, Lydia Curliss, will be presenting this paper together, kind of tag teaming here. Thanks so much to Kyle, to Adriana, and to Nathan, and all the APS folks for this opportunity. So as you can see, the title of our paper here is Data or People. So I really appreciate the keynote, Professor Posner last night, in thinking with us and getting us off on the right foot, thinking about these problems, very, very difficult problems about what it is we do and how we think about collecting and organizing information. I sort of was heartened to know I'm in company of those who also feel uncomfortable thinking about my work in terms of data and data-driven metrics and analysis. This is something that we've wrestled with quite a bit with our collaborations, and I don't think that we're out of that woods yet at all. So for the past 7 years, figure out which one of these things to push here. I've been the PI in a project titled Stolen Relations, Recovering Stories of Indigenous Enslavement in the Americas. And the idea then and now is to centralize the research scholars are doing on the history of Indigenous enslavement and present it in meaningful and sensitive ways for tribes, for lay historians, genealogists, and the wider public. And a central component of this project is a close collaboration with a dozen of tribal nations and communities in southern New England. And this has really helped shape the project a lot. And I have to say, as a historian coming in as a scholar from this sort of field of Indigenous slavery and slavery studies more generally, it's been immensely helpful and instructive to hear a different kind of conversation coming from tribes and individuals through this collaboration. We talk about numbers. We're like, between 2.5 and 5 million indigenous people were enslaved in the Americas between 1492 and 1880. What does that even mean? And how can we think about that only as a past event, right? So different ways of thinking about these histories have really been useful for us. We have about 3,700 entries drawn from 1,300 documents. It's not a huge database, in part because it is so hard to really find the sort of bits and pieces that document Indigenous enslavement in the archive. And frankly, it just is a lot harder than I thought it would be to make this happen, but it is moving forward. So our collaborations have really shaped the project, which I'm really grateful for. And I list up here 4 specific ways this has happened. First of all, focusing on people instead of documents. That might seem really obvious, but it's actually the crux of the problem in some ways for DH projects and databases that tend to tabulate in certain kinds of ways, and in the process inadvertently dehumanize. Second thing is thinking about Indigenous perspectives on slavery in ways that decenter labor. I know that might sound strange as well, but one of the really big revelations for us in a way is that scholars think about slavery in terms of labor and plantations and what's produced and shipped overseas and stuff. For communities that experienced the enslaving process, it's about loss, right? And so thinking very, very differently about the meaning of enslavement, and so this verbiage of stolen became really important for us over time, which is why it's called Stolen Relations. Third thing is seeing enslavement of natives as an important part of settler colonialism. Again, as just one of many things that chipped away at Indigenous sovereignty and community stability and even the land base over time as well. And finally, also recognition that these events are not just in the past, thinking more specifically about historical trauma and connection to the present, which I, as a historian, are not always used to thinking about in some ways. So really helpful. So several important questions come out of this, and I apologize for the text-heavy slides here, but these are also in the paper for the most part. But the first one is really this question of, this question of access, I think, is really important, but also I think this question of the different aims of the DH community versus what sort of tribes want out of this project. And we find ourselves repeatedly sitting down together and sort of what we think might be important for the field or for the world DH or scholars is not at all what tribes think is important or Indigenous communities think is important. So number 2, how do we reconcile the form and specificity of data collection, so-called, desired by Indigenous communities, with sometimes the necessarily reductionistic nature of linked open data, and it's something we're wrestling with as well. Third, what decolonization methods have worked best to use archival materials without letting them push aside or negate indigenous ways of knowing and organizing information. Then finally, again, think about historical trauma. How can we sort of, if at all, if it's even possible, to sort of buffer or mitigate or do something positive with regard to historical trauma that communities experience. So I'll turn it over to Lydia and then come back again in a second.
Oh, wow. Okay. Here we go. So I will be talking kind of more centered on our community collaborations. So this has been an ongoing thing that we did starting in the fall of 2019 when we pivoted the project to really center it more on community. And they've expressed several concerns, and I don't think that they're unique to our project. Some of these concerns include the fact that in creating a database, you're necessarily categorizing, which can be dehumanizing. And in this project, like, the whole point is that we are trying to regain and re-give humanity to these people. So how do we kind of, make sure that in describing, we're not reducing these just to data points? As well, archival documents have a lot of problematic language, and so if we're using those terminologies to describe these documents, we're replicating harmful and racist language. And so we need to be really mindful of this and think about ways to kind of maintain the integrity of the document while still kind of describing these in ways that are not harmful. Another big thing that has kind of come up for our community partners is making sure that these communities have access to this data first. For many of our community partners, when we reached out to them to ask them to be a part of this project, it was the first time they had kind of really ever engaged with Indigenous enslavement in this way. This is not something that is well known in our communities. I can speak for myself. Prior to joining the project, I didn't really understand kind of the impacts of Indigenous enslavement, and I think that that's very true for Indigenous communities, and it's another thing that kind of has been used to erase our histories and our knowledges, and kind of taken us away from those spaces. Another thing is that we've been really cognizant of the fact that we want to present the material in a way that doesn't perpetuate these narratives. So really making sure that we are very clear in the narratives of domination and disappearance, and adequately recognizing that Indigenous communities have persisted. So making sure that in everything that we're doing, we're really tying it back to, generational trauma and the fact that, it still has impacts on these communities today. So as I said, these concerns are not unique to our tribal community partners or our project, and we foresee this kind of continuing on as we expand our project and kind of spread out through the US, because we are kind of running low on data sources in New England, so that will be something that we'll have to do at some point. So throughout this project, we've wrestled with these issues, which can kind of be broadly applied to the field. And one of the underlying issues is the fact that this project is designed to create access to archival documents. And oftentimes for communities, they don't have access to them, they don't know they exist, they're hidden away in these colonial institutions that have been unfriendly and unwelcome places for Indigenous communities. So this has also led us to have conversations around if these archival documents are freely available on the web, if they're available in these archives, does that mean that that gives us the right to make them freely available in our database? Or do we need to be in consultation with every community all the time to make sure that, anything that's going in our database, we have permission for? And of course, that is a problem because we don't necessarily have those ties to all those communities, so we have to make sure that we're kind of balancing the need, like everybody's needs, not just our tribal community needs, but prioritizing those needs. Okay. So another thing is that we've kind of struggled with this dichotomy of representing the original documents and mitigating harm. So in presenting the data, we're aiming to describe these documents in ways that preserve the records, because the archival record is important and we can't deny that it's important, but we need to bring forth the fact that these documents are non-neutral and center the Indigenous perspectives and identities. So throughout the work in this project, it's become a priority to return agency to tribal communities, and that means in thinking through the ways that we describe these records and our partners, giving them agency to kind of talk about their own communities in ways that are relevant to their contemporary, communities, but also their historical communities, and really making sure that we're working with them at every step of the process. Part of this project has meant that in consultation with a couple of our tribal partners, our development team has been working to work through what decolonizing the database means. And obviously, decolonizing is a very long, lengthy process, and I personally don't think that it's necessarily something that you can do, especially within the constraints of a Western database and Western knowledge systems, but we are really trying to think through how can we at least indigenize this perspective and really bring light. So I will turn it back over to Lynn to talk about more specific. Oh wait, no, I have one more slide. Haha, I haven't presented in years, so this is really exciting. So as we've kind of mentioned, historical documents and using them in projects around Indigenous communities is complicated.
Sorry, I might be going the wrong way. I don't know.
Am I?
I mean, on this
Oh.
side.
There we go.
Yes.
I am going the wrong way. There we go. Okay, so examples from the database. There we go. So as I've mentioned, it's complicated. And the archival records have primarily been written by white male colonizers, and we have to understand that when we're using these data sources to talk about anybody's knowledges or histories. So in archival institutions, and by extension digital projects, we must consider and address these issues. So in the Stolen Relations Project specifically, we've struggled with how we kind of want to handle this. And so kind of these are our example fields, so race, gender, and a tribal affiliation. And I'll turn it back over to Lynn to kind of talk about that more.
All right, so quickly, just in 2 minutes here, as we finish up. So some of these terms here, and as we heard last night too, part of the challenge is taking these documents and forcing them, shoehorning them into very specific kinds of categories and taxonomies that don't always fit because they're multiple and overlapping, or they change over time, or whatever else. And so things like race is really one of the challenges. Gender, also status. How do we define slavery in these contexts? That's really challenging too. I just want to highlight some of the ways that we've been thinking about this decolonizing context and thinking about getting people, so this is not public yet, so you can't find this, but hopefully within a year we'll have a different version of this out there. But when people come to the site, to force them immediately to think about what it is they're looking at, what the problems are that are associated with the different kinds of information that are on the site. So this sort of welcome screen that pops up that forces people to sort of at least nominally read it before they click close, but also other ways too. So there's a general decolonizing statement that would be in our experimental search interface that is really just for our internal purposes for the moment, just to sort of keep on reminding users of this. But then also when you do searches, when you run specific searches, decolonizing kind of sidebar pops up that acknowledges the limitations that the archives have and the problems therein. So another thing I just point out too is one way we've been trying to get around this question of data versus people is our programmers create an algorithm that pumps out like a 2-sentence summary of people instead of just sort of a database listing. And this has really helped us just in terms of our own internal purposes and thinking about these people and their experiences. So that's really kind of, well, I guess one more thing to mention too is that even though databases want you to have one answer or one, kind of thing for each person or each category that you're tabulating, we've tried to come up with ways of inserting multiple kinds of possibilities. And again, the race category is really important here. There's a whole conversation we had that I outlined in the paper about whether or not what the database wants you to do is to give one answer, but actually that's not how people's lives work in different kinds of ways. So anyway, we're playing with different ideas. I'm sure that we're missing some other examples in the field. I can't wait to hear more from all of you to sort of lend some insight. So thanks so much for your time.
Looks like something I'd make. Okay. Hello, everybody. As we already heard today, happy Pride Month. So good to be here. Thank you. I heard that clap. My name is Sophie Ziegler. I'm the head of digital programs and services at LSU Libraries, where among many other things, I manage the Louisiana Digital Library, which I'll be talking about today. So thank you for having me. Thank you for being here. Thank you for sitting in this room and for streaming and coming in from wherever you are. My presentation, believe it or not, I actually chose all these words. We don't know if it can be done, but it won't be done without all of us building an ethical, open data community of practice and small and medium-sized cultural heritage institutions. That's right, I did not change that. Here we go. I'm going to start with just a large premise and then move on to a couple of foundational questions for the project as a whole, but also for this presentation. So the very first sort of assumption that I'm making, feel free to disagree, is that most historic open data comes from large, well-funded institutions, large and well-funded institutions, right? So because those are the places that have staff available to make material available. Those are the places where staff understand current trends in open historic data and what researchers might be interested in. And thus those collections are overrepresented in digital projects of all types. And so one of the questions that we wanted to explore is how do we get small and medium-sized institutions to be part of the historic open data initiatives, right? Because the idea here is that smaller institutions have great things. Researchers would benefit from having some of those great things available as open data. And smaller institutions want to help researchers, ergo, it would be good to have smaller institutions share open data. We also want to ask how we can do digitization selection ethically, right? And then the premises and conclusion here is that institutions have a lot of stuff, so selection always needs to be made about what stuff is digitized and shared as data. We also know that selection at the archival, library, museum level has always traditionally favored the powerful and marginalized others. So we should be very careful when we do selection for digitization. And finally, and we've heard a lot about description already, so I won't spend a lot of time on this, but we do know that a lot of institutions have been collecting for a very long time. And for a long time, collections were described by powerful white people for powerful white people. There were a lot of us who would not have been welcome in certain institutions several decades ago. And institutions have a lot of things that are described in what we would now consider absolutely inappropriate ways. So we should be careful about what metadata we do actually share. So that's the big stuff. Let's funnel it down to my favorite state library. The Louisiana Digital Library is our statewide Digital Library of Louisiana. We think of it as our front door to Louisiana's digital cultural heritage with a wide variety of participating institutions. We have public libraries, academic libraries, archives, museums, government repositories, independent research institutions of all types. We also have a very decentralized infrastructure, right? So unlike a lot of digital projects that are collaborative like this, and unlike a lot of state libraries at other states who take advantage of the fact that their members have their own digital repositories and harvest content, that's not the case in Louisiana. With only 2 exceptions, none of our members have their own digital repositories. If it weren't for LSU maintaining the Louisiana Digital Library, I'm afraid the cultural heritage and digital forum in Louisiana would go away for the most part. So we had to make sure that we had an infrastructure in which our partners could log in to the site, brand their own area, upload their own content, decide what goes in, describe how they say it can be used and reused, and then do all the description for it, so they have complete control over that. In 2019 to about 2021-ish, we were lucky enough, the Louisiana Digital Library, I should say, was lucky enough to be part of a Collections as Data part, the whole project, with funds from the Mellon Foundation, re-granted through the University of Nevada, Las Vegas. Our particular project, among a cohort that was tasked with finding operational ways to create data at the institutional level. Our project was called, and 25 of our closest friends, the Louisiana Digital Library's community-focused data. We thought this was a fantastic name at the time because the LDL had about 26 members, so LSU and 25 others, and we wanted to make sure that we were including everybody and being very inclusive. It's great for digital libraries, right, to grow. So even before the grant was accepted, there were, more friends. And then it just kept growing and growing, which is great for the LDL, but made our title look increasingly ridiculous. So then we just started calling it LDL as Data. So this is sort of the LDL as Data project. We were wondering, could we just make the entirety of the LDL open data? So we know that a project like big and ambitious like that's going to have a lot of technology needs, right? A lot of technology needs, and we had, kind of had a sketch of what that would look like. But we didn't want to do that yet, right? Because we also know there'd be a strong community component. So we wanted instead to really think about these questions. So is this something that all 30 plus LDL institutions want? Is this something that's appropriate for all collections within the LDL, and who would get to decide that? And how can we as a group consider the ethical implications of doing this? And given our great variation in types of institution, what would this even look like at a state library level? So this is sort of the overview of the project. We did an intro survey to get a baseline of where we are in terms of digitization, selection, and description. Then we came up with some sample projects because we wanted to be as clear as possible about what it is that we're talking about to very busy professionals at other institutions who don't spend time thinking about this. And then we had an online speaker series to contextualize our work among scholars and practitioners across the country. And then we had an outro survey to see how we did and where we are now. Our intro survey, we learned some fun stuff, like who is digitizing the stuff at our member institutions? Like, who's even doing that? Most respondents have 1 or 2 full-time employees, which is actually pretty good, working on digitization initiatives. Like for the size of most of us, like that's pretty good. 6 institutions have more than 2. That was actually super fancy. And then kind of a lot say that they have less than 1 full-time employee contributing, which is just kind of again what we might expect given the size and focus of some of the institutions. And then we also wanted to know who chooses what to digitize. So most places are saying that certain employees choose what gets digitized in their case. Several said that they actually have no standard means of deciding, and I really appreciate everybody willing to take this survey. I think it shows a lot of trust to just be able to say, like, we don't really do that. And then a good chunk said that decisions are based on patron requests, grant funds, and donor needs, and so they're kind of done ad hoc that way. We moved on to the sample projects. This was, again, just to make sure that what we were talking about was as concrete as possible. So the first thing that we did was build a textual evaluation of oral history project. So we did these online tutorials of, like, this is how you would make a data set from oral history, transcription, the LDL. This is how you clean it up, and then we sort of play around with word frequency and data basic and text comparison and visualization using Voyant. And then we did another one on digital mapping of nature images from the LDL, where we demonstrate geotagging and using Google My Maps. Because we just wanted again, when we're talking about using LDL content outside of the LDL interface, just make it as clear as possible. Then we had our speaker series, in which over the course of about 8 months, we had as many speakers from just all over the place, so many wonderful practitioners, so many wonderful theorists. We had Dorothy Berry centering the margins and digital project planning. She was talking about her project at Harvard, which has since wrapped up, and she's written some really wonderful things about it, so please do take a look if you get a chance. Tonya Sutherland talked to us about redistribution and restorative justice and her project to just survey, sort of take a look at what institutions are doing across North America for that. Jacqueline Warnemont was talking about the possibilities and perils of collections as data, focusing specifically on feminist ethics of care and really responding to the individuals in your collections, which is beautiful. And the APS's very own Brian Carpenter talked to us about developing community collaboration and archival curation. Thank you, Brian. And then we had our outro survey. So here are some other things we learned. So we asked people what was the most helpful thing about this project. Most people said the LDL as data speaker series, because that really helped them contextualize the conversations we were having within what some people around the country were having, and really understanding how the LDL fits in, really creating an expectation that we are part of current trends and developments in digital librarianship. Followed by meetings and or focus groups with other LDL administrators, which I think makes a lot of sense because we're scattered all over the state of Louisiana. We don't tend to have a lot of chances to come together and ask ourselves sustained, critical questions of what kind of digital library we want to build, what kind of work we're actually doing. And then we asked some sort of open questions like, in what ways did this specifically help you? And so people answered that it was great to hear what other institutions are thinking because it can help contextualize what they're doing, and they can sort of compare and contrast with how they do it at their shop versus others so that they feel less isolated. And then a lot of people also like seeing tools out in the real world. We We also asked, in what ways has this maybe changed your practical practice, right? And so about 48% of people said that they changed the way that they communicate cultural diversity when describing their collections, which I think is pretty great. And 24% indicated they have changed the way that they prioritize cultural diversity when deciding what to digitize, which is, I think, really interesting and an ongoing conversation in this community. And then we asked them if this changes at all how they present content. And so people talk about new disclaimers on their online catalogs, probably similar to what y'all were showing, which I think is really great. And then other people also talked about trying to promote the transparency of how digital collections can and cannot be used, right? Because again, we're very interested in use and reuse. But we don't want, anyway, I'll just leave it at that. And also just more transparency about how it is that digital collections are decided on and used out there. Okay, so lessons, here we go. If we are to benefit from the open data of smaller institutions, we need a structured, sustained means of communicating and collaborating, right? We want everything that we did at the LDO to be at least able to inform anybody else who wants to do something similar with a somewhat similar population. And by this, I mean a population of people who work very hard at their library, museum, etc., and just don't have that, digitization is just one part of their job, right? So something like this is always going to be slow, right? It's not going to be fancy. And I think we hear some of this, I think, coming up, about institutions, right? So at the institution level, if you're trying to create material, trying to promote materials that can be used as open data, it's not necessarily on us to build the most fancy, wonderful stuff, right? It's on us to make sure that researchers are able to get to it if they want it. But it's also, sometimes there's some disappointment that it won't be that fancy, right? Because everybody does love the DH projects that really get that wow factor. So it will be slow and it won't be fancy, but we do think inclusion is worth it. I'm really excited for the conversations that we've been having at the LDO. Thank you. Please do follow along if you're so inclined. I look forward to talking. Pardon me.
First, let me thank everybody on the panel once again. Delightful presentations, very thought-provoking. In fact, there are so many questions I have that I feel like we should adjourn and go to a bar to talk about. I'm going to try to restrain myself a little bit here. One overarching question that I might ask first, Willard McCarty, for example, once said sustainability of digital humanities projects is, quote, the elephant in the room. So my first question for everyone, perhaps, is what is your vision for these respective projects? What is your ultimate goal for them?
Yeah, I'll go. Is this on? Ooh, hey, yeah. Oh, I'm going to stay seated if that's okay. So for sustainability, so that's actually something that we talked a lot about. There is no sustainability if there's no future generations that want to continue to do it. And so for the LDL, right? So we're thinking about building a community of practice of people who are cognizant of and have that sort of buy-in for open data. If they retire and other people come in without the same viewpoints, and there's nobody at that at that institution who were on board with that in mind, there is actually no sustainability. And that's just a reality. That's why I think it's very important to situate conversations like what we're doing at the LDO within national trends, right? Because things do come and go. There are practices that my predecessors had at all institutions that I abandoned. And the future people may abandon it. And it's really, I think, just up to those of us doing it now who see value in it to maintain it while we can. And that's my answer. It's kind of a downer.
It's a great question, and we've thought a lot about this as well. And I think that it is the elephant in the room. And I mean, how many times have you gone to like a link and you're like, "Brr," you know, it's not there, it's not available, whatever else. It's so frustrating, right? It's so hard to maintain this. One of the things we're trying to do, and this is where linked open data comes in handy, right? So the enslaved.org project is trying to sort of sit on top of many different projects and also preserve the data set in the Harvard Dataverse as well. So there's a way in which even if we would drop off the map tomorrow, if we can get our data, I'm using that term, I don't want to use that term, through that process, through the Journal of Data Preservation, I think it is, and then into the Harvard Dataverse, at least the information that we've assembled to that point would be accessible in different kinds of forms through enslaved.org and the Dataverse, even if our project itself, the interface, is just static and gone, if that makes sense.
So in the theme of degrees of openness, I'll answer it in the form of degrees of sustainability. There's sustainability of the product. There is sustainability of the user interface, the infrastructure. There is a financial sustainability. There is a sustainability of the ideas. There is a sustainability of the data that we have created. And it's hard to define what a goal is for a project as large as this. Over the centuries, we have managed to figure out that libraries and archives are worthy of funding through central budgets. And we don't do that for digital projects yet. Those are still funded on soft money. It's really hard to have anything sustain as long as there is not institutional support for it. For our project, the lucky part here is that we have stable partners in the Central State Hospital. We have another stable partner in the Library of Virginia. So even if they don't have the ability to digitize and to keep things running, we can hand off our server that is already populated with data to these institutions. So I think an approach to sustainability is to think in terms of continuity plans rather than continuity of a particular artifact. I don't know that I have solved anything, but I think that's just one way of thinking of it.
Thank you. A second broad question that I might pose, it seems to me that the papers all rest on or are underpinned by a commitment to ethical practice. And one thing that I was wondering about while I read them is whether folks have specific ethical traditions or schools of thought or literature that underpins, again, your commitment in these projects.
I'll speak for Stolen Relations. So we're really invested in kind of, it's not really theory, it's really driven by how Indigenous communities expect certain things and kind of creating relationships of reciprocity. We're not gonna go forth and do anything that if they were nope, that's not okay, we're obviously not gonna do that. But also I think it's really important that when you're working with communities, that understanding that it's, to create an ethical relationship, it has to be this sustainable, long-term goal. You can't just go in and be okay, we're gonna use you for your ideas, your knowledge, because that's exactly what archives have been doing for a very long time. So it has to be this open kind of ongoing communication and kind of discussion. And I think that, once you get into ethical things, it's really about who you're working for and what they need. Rather than any kind of brand of ethics, because obviously everyone has a different brand of ethics, so it's just really kind of I see it more as doing right by who you're working for.
To amplify on that a little bit more, we go by similar principles. I don't know that we've ever really sat down as a team and had an ethics talk, but one thing that we have consistently done is be transparent with all our stakeholders about what we are capable of and what we are not capable of. Have respect for the people and have respect for their choices. And I think those would be our guiding principles more than anything else.
That just made me think the R word, right to refusal by Tuck and Wang is a really great paper if you kind of are doing any kind of community work, and I highly recommend reading it.
Can I just say something too? I mean, it's maybe more of an admission than anything else, but sometimes, and this gets to the question of ethics and the money that's spent and the time that's invested by researchers on projects that may or may not actually feel relevant to communities. I know one of the low points for me in terms of my own morale about student relations came last August. We had a summer institute, and we had a bunch of tribal members as a part of that, the conversation. We had 4 weeks of meetings and so forth. And at one point, after we got to know each other in like the third session, one of the tribal elders basically said, "Why are you doing this project?" And it was really, really a hard moment, but I think a really important moment. What is it that we bring, and what leverage do we bring in terms of resources and time and money, and why, if it's not actually something that's central to these communities as well? And so I don't know if that's like ethical considerations proper, but it really gets to the heart of the questions of sort of how we justify what we're doing and how we go about it and for whom.
I'm curious, this ethical question is really interesting, and there's different communities of ethics, and I'm thinking about you as an historian, right? I mean, we have norms and best practices in the profession, and like I was kind of thinking about this follow-up question, like it sounds like they almost have like right of veto over materials that go up, but we want to tell a full telling of the past, right? And so like I'm obviously coming up with a hypothetical, but you've got this data set, and they said, like, this 10% is just too traumatic, or just, something we just don't want to share. So we'd like you not to share the 90% that we've selected that serves our community needs, but that 10% we don't want publicly shared. But that seems to me that kind of fundamentally violates what we do as historians, which is to, do a fulsome telling of the past to the best we can, and particularly in terms of collections and data, which is to tell the whole story as best we can, given the limited records that we have. So I'm curious I'm thinking about this in terms of a project we'll be talking about next time, because I get some angry emails every once in a while because there's racial slurs in our project on redlining, and people are offended by it, rightly so. And I tell them, you should be offended, write your congressman and ask the federal government to address the racist policies that you find so offensive from the past, right? But I'm not removing it, right? Like, so I'm curious your thoughts on that issue.
Yeah, it's a huge one. And so I didn't really get to this in the presentation, or we didn't, but in the paper we kind of raised this question of like who owns the past, and who safeguards and who sort of kind of gatekeeps the past. And I hear you. I think that, especially when you have public documents that are already out there in different kinds of forms, like how can then communities sort of say, we don't want that out there, but it's already out there, right? So, but it is different to collect it and present it in certain kinds of ways, right? And I think that's what collaboration for us at least means, is taking that seriously. And so it doesn't mean that we go to the mass archives and burn up the stuff that's in there, and say, oh, it can't be out there. But for our project, we don't. If they would say we don't want that out there, we would respect that. We really honestly would. It hasn't come to that yet because actually, they see the value. And what they care about more is the proper framing and contextualization. So people come to these documents, they are sensitized, and they are given a framework to understand these documents that you wouldn't have otherwise. So that's where the real energy has gone in many ways.
Yeah, and I'll say for myself, like a really helpful, like kind of contextualization framing comes from like Indigenous knowledge perspectives, which is the fact that not all information is for everyone. So if you think about it in that way, right, like if there's information that exists in archives that is pertinent to Indigenous communities, like first of all, that information was not freely given. So by giving autonomy back and like basically the right to decide, you're giving back autonomy to these communities and the right to their own information. So for me, it doesn't really, I don't know. I think that like telling history is important, but I also think that Indigenous communities' rights to decide what information they want to share and what they don't is really important, especially given the context of settler colonialism.
So I'll take that a step further. In our project, we have mostly government records. These are reports written by hospital administrators back to the governor. These are annual meeting minutes. And at some point in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, I want to say, the hospital started maintaining clippings of newspaper articles. Right? I mean, that's about as public as anything gets. But they had a perception at the time that they were being presented in a negative light through an agenda. And these clippings, they do not want to be public. So there is public information that they do not want to be included in what we will make public through our project. And so far, we have resisted making anything public from our data set, even though lots of those materials are clearly already in the public domain and someone could find them elsewhere. And that's what I mean by respecting the choices of our stakeholders.
So if we could, I think Bobby here has a question, then we'll go to one that Adriana has online.
Yeah, Bobby Lee. This is a related question or maybe a follow-up, but for those of you who are interested in restricting access to materials, I think something that we don't often think about in DH, I mean, I don't think about it as a humanist who's desperate to have people interact with my work, right, is security. And how do you have, if you're trying to restrict access to materials, do you have protocols in place for data security? I mean, this, I only started thinking about this recently when, like, I heard about real-world examples of, like, DH projects getting hacked for various reasons, malicious or not malicious. But do you have any protocols in place for thinking about data security?
So we spent a lot of time on this before we digitized any data. We conducted analyses of what Amazon could offer us in terms of cloud services. Amazon offers a HIPAA-compliant cloud service and a generic one. We analyzed the local university offerings. And after everything, we decided that nothing gave us security like our own hardware. You cannot beat iron when it comes to security. If you do not have physical access to something, it is incredibly hard to break in. So yes, our data sits behind a couple of firewalls. Our data sits behind access logins. Our data is on encrypted disks, absolutely. We store off-site data on disconnected hard drives that are powered down most of the time. We have copies in the state of Texas and in the state of Virginia. We have multiple backups of these copies. So yes, we take security and reliability of data extremely seriously because a lot of money has been spent in digitizing these records, and we are not going to get our hands on the paper records a second time. Oh, reputation is something you can only lose once.
Okay, I have a question for Sophie. Thank you so much for the presentation. I want to get in, and this is also if other panelists have thoughts on this topic too, but on reuse. So you've done this great work, and all of your colleagues and friends, on getting a lot, making a bigger tent, like bringing a lot of, LSU is definitely a big institution, and it's making possible a lot of things for smaller and medium ones. And part of sustainability is also highlighting reuses. How do you give a spotlight to those? Because those reuses can often re-inform how to present the materials themselves. They can give people ideas on how to do reuse. Like people conceptually like the idea, but they're often like, could you show me an example? So what are ways that you can integrate reuse either back into the collections or point them out to people? Because even small and medium institutions still will feel unapproachable to some people, general public, even if they don't have an imposing building that they're in. So where people, as part of this, when people do reuse, how do you make it known that they are welcome to let us know about what you did so that we can make these resources better in turn?
Yeah, thank you. That's a great question. I didn't include it in this presentation, and I didn't really talk much about it in the paper either. But if you do follow the footnotes and go look at the full survey, we spent a decent amount of time talking to folks during the project about use and reuse, right? So we're making the distinction between use and reuse. So use would be like it showing up in footnotes, an item from the LDO. And reuse would be like it being in a TikTok video, just by way of example, bringing it back to TikTok. So normally when we think about reuse and what it means and what people do with stuff, et cetera, we're following along with the DLF working group on reuse, which has done a lot of amazing things. And one of the speakers for our speaker series, who didn't make it on the slide, unfortunately, was Michelle Riley. So Michelle, if you're watching this, hello. She did a wonderful talk. She's at the University of Arkansas. She did a wonderful talk on tracking reuse. And she does a very good job of making the point that you'll never know everything. Right? And you can know a lot if you're willing to be super creepy and like, right? And like pack the tracking technology into your images. So most of us, probably don't want to be creepy. So there are ways that we can do it. There is metadata that you can embed that's less creepy that sort of helps you track it. But there's just a number of like more practical ways you can do to track it from the institution side. Like make sure when you download the content that it's got something identifiable in the title, right? Nobody downloaded anything from the ODL today because we haven't fixed that. It still comes across as OBJ. So that's from the institution side. From the user side, institution side of tracking it. As to trying to make it where people who reuse content will want to tell us about it, we have a friendliness problem. And I think that's a little bit of what you were getting at when you said people might not feel like they can do it. And I don't know what to do about that. It's just because our communities that we serve as, just say as like universities, right, are just so large. And then the communities, we have this hope that people we haven't even thought of will want to use our stuff. So it's just very hard to do that type of outreach. I smile a lot at students, so maybe that'll help. I hope that kind of helps. Does anyone else have thoughts about that?
Adriana, questions from our online audiences?
Yeah, so there's some really great questions coming in online, so thank you again to our virtual participants. Keep sending them in. So I'm going to go through all of them, and I'll invite the panelists to answer whichever spark joy in you. So there's a question particularly about the Stolen Relations Project, about the reframing that happened in 2019. If you would like to offer more details about what sort of catalyzed that reframing. Questions about labor and sort of who counts as staff in the digitization process, how you think about interns and volunteers in that process. Question also going back to ethics and visibility about content disclaimers, how they're created, how they're made visible, who informs them. And then also back to sustainability, what kind of resources are you using to keep things up and alive? Is it Internet Archive, or do you have other things available that you're using to keep your projects visible? So take whatever pleases.
I'll take the easy ones. So we did all of our digitization commercially. We contracted with the company, had them deal with it. We are dealing with culturally sensitive, historically invaluable materials. We did not want to do this in-house with substandard equipment, and we did not have the money to buy the right kind of equipment. The biggest challenge for us was setting up a process so that we could get good metadata back with the digitized materials. Once we had done that, the rest of the process was pretty flawless. The metadata that we got back was, of course, very rudimentary, but it was better than not having anything. That was the metadata part. I know I had something else, but please, I'm sure it'll come back.
I could just talk quickly about the repositioning or the pivoting of stolen relations into 2019. I confess it started out just like a normal academic project. I don't know. You are nerdy and get to the archives. You realize that there's all these people also in the archives and no one's talking to each other and centralizing things. They're like, well, it'd be great if we just built this resource. But there was a growing, nagging sense that I was just doing yet another project for academics, by academics, that ultimately had really no relevance to the lives, the people that, whose ancestors we were, collecting information about. And honestly, this is like, I think initially it was like, well, we should talk to the tribes, or talk to indigenous peoples. And actually what we found out is it really transformed the project and our thinking about this history in amazing ways. So it's hard work. It takes a lot of sensitivity and patience, and I don't think we're doing it perfectly, honestly. It's hard, but it's really, really worthwhile. And I'm aware of the time it takes them to be a part of it, and so we compensate all of their time as consultants, which is really important. So yeah, it's an ongoing work in progress.
Oh, about the question to, sorry, were you about to say something? No, okay. So it did come back. How do we keep things running now? As a part of our application to Mellon, or funding from Mellon, one of the conditions is that whatever they fund has to be made available for 8 years after the funding period. This is incredibly hard to do for academic institutions, especially state institutions, because our funding is tracked on an annual basis. We are not allowed to spend anything for a future year. So right now, things are being paid out of the generosity of King Davis and some other funds that he manages to corral in. Once we are done with our 8-year period, I'm not entirely sure where it's going, but we are always looking for additional funds. And at some point, we might have to fall back and hand over everything to the Library of Virginia and have them deal with it. We don't really know, but so far, we have been extremely fortunate. And I guess incredibly thankful of King's efforts in making this happen.
Well, we are at 20 past the hour. I think we owe a round of applause to our fantastic panelists.